If everybody could drop A in the chat if you can see and hear me clearly, we'll get started in just a minute or so. All right, great. All right, so cool. Let's get right onto the charts. All right, so this week has been pretty uneventful for me. I did take one trade last night, which I'll get into. That was on AUD NZD, but we can take a look at gold. I know that's a pair that's been moving pretty heavily recently. So if you guys have never been on my stream before, welcome. I'm more so of a swing trader here, and I do like to do quite a bit of top-down analysis. So I do like starting with some of these higher time frames, like the weekly and the monthly time frame, just to get that bird's eye view of the market, see, where it's been headed, what it's been doing in the most recent of times, things of that sort. All right, so let me zoom into the monthly time frame on gold. And here you can see that we are in a steady uptrend, right? So just making higher highs and higher lows, right? And so one thing that stands out to me on gold is the fact that we have this piece of resistance here that we actually broke and retested. We actually dipped a little bit under, and now we've actually started to continue this strong move to the upside. You can see that nice bullish engulfing candlestick that entered the market and gave us some momentum back to the upside right here. All right. So I definitely have a bullish bias on gold just off of these higher time frames, right? So let's come down to the daily and see exactly what's been going on. And I'll just remove this resistance line, this monthly resistance, just for clarity purposes. But here again, you can see this steady uptrend, right? This steady move to the upside. We recently had a bullish flag that we broke out of, right? And upon that break, it seems like we've now continued this move to the upside. So now what I'm going to do is zoom a little bit closer so we can take a closer inspection at price. All right. So one thing that stands out to me is the fact that we've come and given this region a break and retest, right? So it was acting as resistance. We came back to retest that zone, and now it looks like we're continuing this steady move back to the upside here on gold, right? One thing that I do like here is the fact that we have this order block, right? So this is a concept that has been becoming a little bit more popular in the Forex industry, but we had a nice retracement back into this region. You can see this quick wick that entered that zone, and upon that wick, we did retrace back into that region one more time, and now it looks like we're returning back to the upside. So I do have a bullish bias on gold. No entries for me right now, but definitely a pair that I'm looking at going into next week. All right, so I'm checking the chat now. I just want to say good morning to Sonia. I hope I pronounced that right. Good morning, Lorenzo. Good morning, T-On. I hope I pronounced that right. Forgive me if I did not. All right, but let's get back into the charts. Let's also take a look at silver. All right, let's actually come to the weekly, see a little bit more of the charts. All right, so you can see, at least in the most recent of times, we have been in a steady uptrend on silver. So coming back down to the daily, there's a little bit of range movement going on where it's just sort of pinballing back and forth between these regions here, right? And so I'm just looking for some sort of break and retest scenario. Okay. Really just waiting for that signal that will tell us where price might be headed towards next. All right. One thing I also like to look at are some of these exotic pairs, and particularly USD ZAR, which is the South African rand, and USD TRY, which is the Turkish lira as well. All right. So starting out with the weekly time frame on USD ZAR, you can see that we have been in a pretty steady uptrend, making these higher highs and higher lows. In the most recent of times, we have been in a pretty strong uptrend. If we, excuse me, a pretty strong downtrend actually, if we just focus in on this region here. And what stands out to me is the fact that we have broken a pretty significant level of support off of the weekly. So what I'm going to do now is just take a closer inspection at price and see exactly what's been happening. All right. All right, so this was a pretty nice break and retest scenario here on USD ZAR, right? So after breaking that region of support, we had a little bit of a retest and then we kept dipping back down. This is not a trade that I necessarily would have taken. I would have actually preferred if we could have seen some sort of retracement back into this order block region here. Okay. Right. That would have sort of been my um, ideal entry, just because of the fact that, oftentimes when you see these order blocks or these impulsive moves, either to the upside or the downside in the order of, in the form of a bullish or a bearish engulfing candlestick, usually those are moves done by institutional traders. And what you'll see happen is that usually they return back to those positions, grab the liquidity, and continue shifting the market in whatever direction that they please, right? So I do see a couple of order blocks forming here. Um, and one thing I've also noticed just in my own personal back testing is that I tend to see them just right above or just right below regions of support and resistance, right? So usually just wicking right above or below those areas. And those are very, high level areas of interest for me when it comes to executing my own positions. So I even see one here as well that's being formed. Given that we did break a pretty significant level of support off of the weekly time frame, I do have a bearish bias just for now, unless I see some sort of correction back to the upside on this pair. But yeah, definitely a bearish bias for now, and definitely targeting some of those order block regions. All right. Good morning, Delanka. Good morning, Aaron. All right, so this is USD TRY, or the Turkish lira. Let's come back to the monthly time frame. Again, similar to USD ZAR, we did see a pretty strong uptrend right off of these higher time frames, higher highs and higher lows. Coming to the weekly, you can see that we're starting to break this level of resistance and continue this steady move to the upside, right? A little bit of break and retest scenarios happening here, right? So if I just draw my horizontal tool here, hopefully that makes the break and retest scenario a little bit more apparent. No order blocks that really stand out to me in terms of where I might see price dipping into, but definitely a pair I'm watching going into next week. And I definitely will wait and see how more price action develops in this region here. that might indicate we will want to continue making that steady move to the upside. So definitely a bullish bias on USD try going into next week. In terms of when I trade, I don't really like to execute on Fridays. It's mainly Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays that I execute my positions. No other reason other than the fact that one, I am a swing trader, and that's usually when I see some of my setups come into play in the market. And two, because of my own, back testing and track record, there's one great website called My FX Book that you can look at all sorts of data and statistics about your trading. And one thing that you can see is, your win rate by the day that you executed your position. And personally, what I found is that usually when I execute my positions on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, that's when I tend to have the highest win rate. And Friday was actually the day, if I executed a position that day, that was when I had one of my lower win rates. So my FX book is a pretty cool tool. You can see like all sorts of data and statistics on your own trading and track record. So yeah, I really love that platform. All right. All right, so this is USD NOK, another exotic player that I do like to trade. Let's come over to the daily. So similar to a lot of these exotic pairs that we've already looked at, you do see a pretty significant uptrend off of the higher time frames. But I want to come down to some of the smaller ones to see if there's any more immediate opportunities. Right. So right off the bat, you can see that I denoted this support turned resistance line in yellow, and you can see how reactive we are to that zone. Right. Every time we come back to this region, we bounce off of it in some form or fashion. And in the most recent of times, you can see that every time we've come back to this zone, we've rejected that region. So going into next week, no opportunities that stand out to me right now, but I would be interested in seeing if we can come back to this zone here, and it might be a potential opportunity to execute a short position, given that we've returned to that zone quite a number of times and rejected it as well. I would wait to see how price action develops if we do make a return back to that region. All right. Let's come over to some of the major currency pairs now. All right. So here's GBPUSD. Let me come to the weekly actually. And you can see that GBPUSD, it's sort of come to a halt at this region of resistance here. It's been here for quite a number of weeks now. And I'm really just waiting for a very clear breakout to see the next major move that's going to happen on GBPUSD. Coming over to the 4-hour, you can see I've put a box around this region of consolidation that GBPUSD has been in for quite a number of weeks now. Last week, I believe, is when GBPUSD is sort of started to crack out of this consolidation. So right here, and I thought we were going to get some sort of retest and finally make a move to the upside, right? So I saw that GBPUSD had broken out of this region of resistance, if you will, or this box of consolidation. And now I was just waiting for some sort of retest. And that's why I find it so important to look at price action and what's going on some of these smaller time frames, because it'll give some insight into what might happen next with this pair. We never got any clear indication that price was respecting that region here when it broke out. and it basically just dipped right into that box of consolidation. You can see that upon the retest, it was in the form of a bearish engulfing candlestick. On some of these smaller time frames, there was no indication that or patterns that indicated that we wanted to continue moving. So again, still sitting on the sidelines with this pair, just staying patient and seeing what may happen next, right? All right. Coming over to, let's see, coming over to AUDNZD. So this was actually the one trade that I did take this week. Again, it was a pretty uneventful week for me. Just one position that I executed on. Let me actually come to the monthly time frame so I can give you guys uh, that holistic top-down analysis for these pairs. But AUD NZD, it's been in what I would consider a descending channel, right? Just making some back and forth motion within this region that I've kind of boxed in. And without not too much analysis off of these higher time frames, I was expecting us to continue this trend intuitively and make a return back to that supportive region, that trend line in the descending channel. All right, so coming to the daily, actually, let's come to the 4 hour. I think it'll become a little bit more apparent. We had a break and retest scenario, right? So upon breaking this region of support, I saw that we had retraced back and retested that zone as resistance. And not only that, but it paired up pretty nicely with this order block, which I'll circle just so that's a little bit more clear, right? So we came back and we retested this order block. We actually even pushed even further and came back into this region as well. I was seeing some nice wick rejections during London session last night, which is what triggered me to execute my position. So in a little bit of drawdown, I noticed that when NFP hit, we did start spiking a little bit up and show some bullish momentum on this pair. So we'll see how it turns out. It is getting a little close to stop loss, but just a part of the game. All right, so with that, I'll go into the chat and see if there's any pairs that you guys are looking at that we can maybe take a look at together. All right, so I see Mark Darris. He asks, how do you determine you are ready to size up? So I'm assuming you mean, how do you determine if I'm ready to start stacking positions on maybe some opportunity that I see in the market? Good question. So what I do is whenever I'm ready to execute, we can take AUD NZD for example. I always execute half of my position upon my initial entry, and then if price is ever to retrace 20 pips or so on any given pair, that's when I execute another half. All right, so that's sort of how I handle my position. There's nothing too technical or complicated about how I dump my positions or stack it into the market. I just know that more than likely you're going to experience some sort of retracement on any given pair. And being that my stop loss is usually 40 to 50 pips, I think halfway, if it retraces halfway, is a decent place to add more positions. Yeah, USD try is a tough pair. It's a tough pair because the swaps are pretty significant. So because I am a swing trader, I do tend to hold my positions overnight. But that's just the cost that I pay to play that game. Yeah, definitely a tough pair, especially when it comes to swaps. Now, on the flip side, some pairs like USD-ZAR, for example, if you're short, they can pay you a pretty decent positive swap as well. So there's a flip side to that coin as well. All right. So I'll go ahead and take a look at just a couple of random major currency pairs. Um, Stuff that I wasn't particularly looking at this week, but I think it'll definitely be valuable in the sense that it'll give you guys more of an insight into how I trade and maybe some stuff that you can implement into your trading as well. All right, so looking at AUD USD, just taking a look at this region here, you can see a pretty significant downtrend, so making lower lows and lower highs. And we've actually retraced back into a pretty significant region of resistance here, right? And what stands out to me here is the fact that we've retraced into this order block region here. You can see how we've actually wicked it perfectly, and it seems like we've been making a head and shoulders pattern is what I see forming here in this order block region, right? So we've wicked that region, and now it looks like we're losing that momentum to the upside, right? So we made a huge surge right into that zone, and now we're struggling to continue making those higher highs, right? So let me sort of paint out what I'm seeing here. I see this left shoulder, I see this head, and I see this right shoulder that's forming here. So let's see if we can complete that formation on AUDUSD and potentially start making a move back down. All right. Let's come over to Euro USD. All right, so Euro USD, very similar to GBPUSD in the sense that on some of these higher time frames, we're starting to kind of approach some significant levels of resistance, right? So this is one that stands out to me here. And another thing about Euro USD is the fact that it also seems as if we're making a head and shoulders pattern as well. So given that we have been in a uptrend in the most recent of times, we're sort of losing that momentum to the upside. But let's zoom in on some of these smaller time frames. All right, so definitely a loss of momentum is what it seems like to me. If I just pull out my trend line tool, you can see that we've been making higher highs and higher lows in the most recent of times, but sort of starting to get a shift in market structure. So let's definitely see what will happen going into next week. All right, so Mark Darris asks, how would news affect your current position since you are a swing trader? What kind of news do you give attention to? That is a very, very good question. All right. So as a swing trader, I do not pay attention to news very heavily. I'm actually very strictly a technical trader. So I focus very heavily on market structure, price action, and I pay very little attention to news as as the form of trading that I've developed for myself. And so as a swing trader, given that you are, holding positions for quite some time, you also take that into account. So you adjust accordingly. You may, lower your lot size because you know that you're holding your position for some time. It might take some time for your trade to actually develop. And because you're looking for slightly bigger moves in the market, as a result, your stop loss may be a little wider. So my stop loss tends to be around 50 to 75 pips, and then I tend to go for maybe 100, 200, 300 pips at any given moment. So I adjust my lot size accordingly, and because of that, um, I don't have to factor in news as heavily. And one thing that I've noticed is that, you know, just by focusing on the technical aspect of trading and looking at some of these higher time frames, you'll see that in the market structure, oftentimes news can already be built into what might already happen in the market. So sometimes I find that news actually helps with my move or whatever I see potentially playing out. It gives it the juice that it needs to happen. Now, that's not to say that I haven't been stopped out by news, but I don't really pay attention to it as much as a swing trader, given that I'm going for longer term setups, and I adjust my lot size accordingly. But very good question, and I hope that gives you some insight into how somebody that's more so of a technical trader or strictly focusing on the technical analysis handles news, right? So, there are times that I do get stopped out, but it's just a part of the game. And there's also a lot of times that I've seen news actually help my position. So I may have been holding a position for a couple of days, and then when a news event spikes, it falls in line perfectly with the market structure and gives the position that juice that it needed to play out. But very good question. All right, so with that, those are a lot of the pairs that I was looking at for this week. Again, a pretty uneventful week for me. We'll see what happens going into next week. But what I can do now is take a look at any pairs that you guys might be looking at if you want to go ahead and drop that in the chat. Let me actually look at NZDJPY, just coming over to the weekly time frame. So here on NZDJPY, you can see this steady downtrend that we've been making, right? So we were making lower lows and lower highs, and now it seems like we had a shift in structure, right? So we're making higher highs and higher lows, and now it seems, at least in the most recent of times, we've started making a steady move to the upside. We broke that trend line, started getting a nice steady move to the upside. Um, but one thing that also stands out to me is the fact that we're running into some resistance, right? So if I just take out my horizontal ray and denote that here. All right, so let me zoom in, come to the 4 hour. Again, you can see those higher highs and higher lows being made. We've actually dipped right into a region uh, of demand here. So you can see that we just wicked that zone, but let me come down to some of these smaller time frames and see exactly what's happening. So it's a little bit unclear to me what JPY might do next, even though we've rejected that region of demand, that order block region. Uh, One thing I do want to point out is the fact that market structure still seems that we may show a little bit of bearish movement, right, with this bearish flag right? So impulse move, bearish flag. It'll be interesting to see what happens next on NZDJPY. So definitely something I'll look at going into next week. Okay, let's see. So Hope says, what kind of indicators you use? Good question. I actually do not use any indicators anymore. I rely solely on market structure and price action. I did used to use the MACD, um, the moving average convergence divergence, and that was mainly just to look at any sort of divergence that may have been happening in the market, just to add that extra piece of confluence. But I found that, with my strategy, relying solely on price action and market structure, support and resistance, Fibonacci, those things work out pretty well for me. All right, let's take a look at USDJPY. Let's come over to the weekly time frame. So USDJPY looks pretty interesting on some of these higher time frames. What stands out to me is the fact that you see this inverted head and shoulders pattern forming, right? So if we take the left shoulder, the head, and then now what looks to be this right shoulder that's forming here on USDJPY. So I really love seeing some of these textbook patterns form on the higher time frames because whatever you see on the higher time frame, it's well established. It took time to form, and so you can sort of trust them a little bit more and go off of that basis, off of what you see on the weekly and the monthly, right? So I really like seeing these textbook patterns on some of the higher time frames. Coming over to the daily, let's take a closer inspection and see exactly what's been happening. All right, so with USDJPY, we've run into a little bit of resistance that we seem to be respecting, right? So it's coming back into that yellow zone. And I see that huge bearish candle off of the daily. Let's take a look at the 4-hour. Okay, so with USDJPY, we're respecting that resistance up top. What I'm going to do now is zoom in a little bit closer because I see a order block that we've actually just rejected, right? So we've come into that order block region and just completely dumped after we touched that zone. Let's come over to the 1-hour. So we basically tapped that order block region. We started dumping from that zone, and now we landed into a region of support. So it will be interesting to see going into next week if we can get some sort of break and retest scenario here. All right, so that's what I'm seeing on USDJPY. All right, let's see. AUDCHF. Okay. So AUDCHF, we have been in an uptrend in the most recent of times, which is what is denoted here. But we are respecting this level of resistance here. And so after respecting that resistance, we've dipped back into this region here of resistance turn support. Coming over to the 4-hour, you can see that we're respecting it pretty well. I would like to see some sort of shift in momentum if we are to continue to the upside, I would need to see some sort of break and retest scenario before considering any opportunity in the market. All right. Let's see. USD CAD coming over to the weekly. So USD CAD, it seems like we're basically just sitting at a pretty key level of support, right? So we've dipped into this region here. That's a very bad drawing. We've dipped into that region here, and it'll be interesting to see how price reacts. But let's come over to the daily. Right. I'm just waiting to see how price would react from a swing standpoint into this zone. Right. I would like to see some definitive rejection, whether it be back to the upside or if we can get a break back below, get a retest. But yeah, that's what I'm seeing here for USD CAD. All right, so I'll take a couple more pairs that I see requested in the chat, and then we can wrap it up for the day. Let's see. I think I covered quite a number of them. NZDCAD. Let's see. NZDCAD. Okay, so with NZDCAD, if we just zoom in on price, we have been in a pretty steady downtrend in the most recent of times, and it looks like we've kind of come to a halt into this zone here. But let's zoom in to the 4-hour. Okay, so that region of support that I drew off of the weekly, you can see that we're bouncing right off of it and making a move back to the upside, right? So definitely would wait to see how price action develops going into next week and if we can break any significant levels of support or resistance here. All right, let me scroll a little bit into the chats and make sure I answered everybody's questions. Let's see. What strategy do you recommend I backtest? I recommend that you backtest the strategy that you use, right? So, there's multiple strategies out there. There's multiple ways to become consistently profitable in the market. And there's a lot of strategies out there that work. But I think it's really a matter of finding a strategy that sticks with your style, and figuring that out may take some time and experimentation, but figuring out a strategy that you like. Are you a swing trader? Are you a scalper? Do you want to rely off of indicators or price action, and back testing it for yourself so that you can see, is this strategy profitable? Has it stood the test of time? And is it something that works with my own schedule? Is it something that I could implement and work well with? But it'll definitely be a matter of finding a strategy out there that works for you, and doing the work of back testing it so that you can see for yourself that it works well. But good question. All right, so with that, I will conclude this session. Thank you guys for tuning in. And it was a pleasure, giving you guys this analysis. I hope you guys were able to get some value out of this. All right, so I do see one more question by Dale. Any books that I recommend? So there isn't any specific book that I've necessarily read that when it comes to trading. It's been more so of trial and error for me, and again, back testing my strategy to make sure that it works for me. All right. All right. So with that, that concludes this session. Again, thank you guys for tuning in. And I'll see a lot of you guys next week.